All right, hello, and welcome to another E-Politeia discussion. This time on Theodicy, we have a great panel consisting of Déaglán, Arca, Demos, often returning, and a new member, Rogue Theologue, hosted by me, of course. All right, everybody, introduce yourselves. A brief thought on Theodicy.
Sure. I think this is a very important topic because the kind of basic response that most people who are stuck in modernist and materialist ways of thinking that comes up when they are introduced to a divine view of the world, the view of the cosmos as a divine emanation or creation or what have you is, well, why is there so much evil? Why do we see evil in nature where there's a lot of suffering? Why do we see what you might call truly wicked evil in terms of heinous historical events? And so I think it's a great topic to address for people who might just be starting to get curious about a non-modern or anti-modern view of the world in general, as well as a Platonist view of the world specifically. So thank you for having me on.
All right, Arca, let's go ahead. Your brief thoughts on Theodicy. Arca?
Oh, well, okay. Yes, I would say I think it's a very important topic because there's a lot of confusion around it, especially nowadays. And I think part of it stems from the confusion between material good and divine good, or higher good and lower good being conflated to mean the same thing.
Sensible enough. Demos, go ahead.
Hello, this is Demos. Theodicy then. Well, obviously, it is a confusing topic for many because most people don't know what exactly the gods are and where to situate them in relation to the world. So they understandably get confused when they see there is a lot of evil. And since materialism is the prevailing view of the world today, most people at least, try to understand evil with a materialist ontology. And since materialism is evil itself, they are understandably confused. But once you understand the Platonic view of things, you come to understand where evil comes from and where the gods are in relation to evil. So you need to learn Platonism, you need to abandon materialism, you will understand everything you need to do.
All right, that gets to the heart of it. And if you want to say anything, Theologue, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's no arcade of evil. I think that's basically what's commonly considered evil is caused by object orientation, or basically people not being grounded, or souls not being grounded in the real ground being, or you can say the real, and rather the operation of the real, which I believe is, the phenomenal, empirical world. And that would be my brief position on why evil exists in a system of reality that is unitary.
Makes sense. All right, so I think we should first start with let's define what evil even is, because when talking about a problem of something, you got to first figure out the problem, and that's a little bit harder than some people would have you believe. And despite the common consensus of what evil is, I assume none of us are are ontological dualists who believe that there's some sort of equal evil god out there, be it Satan or Ahriman, or whatever they're calling it these days. I think we're more or less in the consensus that evil is a lack. Though I think let's discuss about what that actually means. How can a thing? How can something have no being?
Right, I would definitely agree with it. Yes, there's no an objective evil, whether personified or abstracted. It simply does not exist because it goes counter to the idea of God being, perfection and all goodness. And were evil to exist, were there to be such a thing as perfect evil, it would imply necessarily there would be a place where God's influence does not exist, which is impossible. And it's just a logically incoherent concept. Now, I do think that most people from other religions who do believe in the concept of evil, whether personified as Satan or Iman, don't actually consider it to be on the same level as God, but it still does present a certain problem, I think, that we don't confront in the same way.
Makes sense.
Right. Yeah, so that kind of dualist view of the world that you introduced, Aloysius, that can be maybe something that the sort of common believer might not even very consciously, but sort of passively believe. We're fed through popular media a lot of narratives about conflict between good and evil, but it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny at all, because if you had two essential principles, one good and one evil, there would have to be some commonality between them for the two of them to even exist in the same space. There would have to be some common underlying principle, and then that would just be the ultimate principle in the way that the one or the good is. But this privation of evil as lack, or privation of the good, or evil as parasitic on the good, this was explicated by Plotinus. You could say it was maybe implicit in Plato. Plotinus really fleshed it out. This idea that any evil is a lack or a distortion or a falling short of some good, some aspect of being. So that can sound abstract, but I think it lends itself pretty easily to examples. So when someone commits some evil act, that's because of some lack in that person, some lack of virtue, some lack of, or some failure to turn toward the good. And someone experiences sickness, that's a privation of being in their health or constitution. And so you get then not only these common sense examples, but metaphors that are useful for understanding evil. If you have something like a flame that we would take symbolically to be the one or the good, then as that flame radiates, as that flame emanates, necessarily you get darkness and coolness the further you get away from the principle. So the principle being the ultimate good, any emanation from it is necessarily going to involve a decline in that perfection or absolution of being and good, and therefore necessary introduction of some elements of evil simply as lack.
Makes sense. Demos, any thoughts?
Yes, well, I agree with what has been said so far. I would add that there are two kinds of evil, primarily. There is evil as it appears in nature, broadly speaking. So, for example, sickness, animals being born with deformities, natural evil, so to speak. And then there is evil of intent, evil as it exists in souls. So, for example, someone wants to steal something because someone wants something. The difference in between those two should be seen rather than in that in nature, if something appears evil, if we go by the principle of evil being just less good, we have to see that in particular souls, what is good for one soul, one particular soul, rather what is evil for one particular soul need not be evil for all. So we can say that when evil appears in nature, it is conductive to overall good. So for example, sickness may not be good for the person who gets sick, but within the grander scheme of things, sickness is good. Someone will profit from sickness. Viruses profit from sickness, so it's good for them. And if you take a final accounting of all of nature, each what appears to be evil ultimately serves good. There is greater difficulty in explaining evil when rational beings commit evil acts, but I think we can extend the same broad principle to that and say that, as Proclus says, and I'm sure other Platonists, that evil is not existence in itself, but part hypostasis. It is an existence dependent on existence, so it's not real existence. And going by the principle that it is parasitic, we can say that evil, when it is born in the souls of rational animals, is just an inability to actualize the good. So when you commit evil, you are working towards your own good, but in a way that does not take full account of what the good is. So that you want something, you steal it. But you are working towards your good, but in a defective way. And since we are free to act, we mortals have this peculiarity that they can commit evil, whereas, for example, the gods cannot.
Very cohesive, all things considered. Any thoughts, Theologue?
Yeah, Déaglán, is that how you say your username?
Yeah, it's Déaglán is how it actually is.
Déaglán, okay. What you said about dualism, very spot on. Basically, any two principles immediately supposes a relation between those principles. So, suppose an underlying principle underlying both of them. However, I would say that I've always had a bit of a bone to pick with the kind of radiance model or way of looking at emanationism, where you have like the one as it proceeds ontologically becoming like less of itself, because I think it's worth considering that if you have an ultimate principle or like an absolute, that it would be, I think even Plotinus says it is everywhere wholly itself. So I think, in fact, actually, in one of the Enneads, he has some things talking about how, or kind of explaining the like sun analogy a little bit better. So that's not like as the rays of the sun proceed away, you're actually going towards something that is not, the one. Because then you have a partial privation, right? Because if you can have less of the ultimate reality principle in any instance of reality, you kind of have a privation of the real principle. Which is why I kind of said what I think evil is more like, well, no, there's no principle, right? No arche of evil. There's no actual existence of evil. I think that's pretty common. I think Plotinus, he kind of switches what he says a little bit at certain points. Proclus disagrees with some of what he says, but it's pretty common points in Platonism that there's no principle of evil. So I think that we could definitely kind of temper our conception there with object orientation or something like that, where it's really, it's not a thing in itself, or even a lack of being, or even a lack of the good necessarily, but rather something that's kind of occurring in spite of that because of the capacity that souls have to kind of, like, their being is there. If their being is rooted in the good, even though they're doing something evil, their being is still there, and they're just doing their attention, essentially. They're oriented away from it because they're oriented on, like, an operation of it, which is also isn't privation. I like to use an analogy of the imagination, right? Images in the imagination aren't a privation of the mind, but when you're focused on those images, they're not like the mind in itself. You know what I mean? I just thought that'd be interesting to kind of put forward.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So with the radiance metaphor of flame, of course it introduces these potential errors in thinking because you're using a spatial metaphor to talk about something that isn't really spatial. I use that a lot with people when I'm first introducing them to Platonism as a kind of, I think the term in Buddhism is something like upaya, skillful means, right? As a kind of intuition pump or just device to help get someone out of the modern frame of mind by using a symbol that, like any symbol, it both reveals and conceals. I believe I understand what you mean with your object orientation. I guess if we want to say that what you're trying to stress, that one, or the good, is, to use the old phrase, a sphere whose center is everywhere and whose periphery is nowhere. I can't remember who said that originally, but it gets quoted a lot. If we want to stress that, which I think is right, even though it's difficult for us to understand through normal discursive reason, it seems like even with the object orientation, you have to introduce some imperfections of language, like saying, well, you're focused on a partial good rather than the full good. So you're still kind of talking about this almost implicit distance from the good in a kind of semi-spatial way, like you're aiming for something less than, you're aiming away from it. So it seems like you always get stuck with imperfect language no matter what framing you use. And so I think the trick is to just use multiple frames and symbols and realize that you have to go beyond them with your intuitive intellection because you can't phrase these things perfectly.
Well, yeah, we have actually kind of discussed this in, like, our own private discussions. We do that. That's all we do. I mean, I've said I'm of the view essentially that I don't think any metaphor will ever actually be true. If it could, then it would be so evidently true that it would be impossible to be wrong. But since we cannot transmit true information, so something that is well and truly true, we really need a better word for that. A metaphor's value is less in it being simply correct, and in fact more in its ability to lead someone to understanding what is correct.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And I think that's definitely true. These things are good at kind of inspiring the reader to think a certain way. But I think as far as, like, just real quick, I'll address the object thing. You could kind of understand it a little bit better with not really a partial good. You kind of have to just understand beings having a capacity to have this internal operation that isn't the being in itself, which would be kind of like like just pretend that the one is like a divine mind and not like a apophatic for a minute. It would be like, there's that mind in itself, and then its thoughts wouldn't be like a privation of it, but it would be something it just kind of does by its very nature. But yeah, no, I agree with all that. I just think it's definitely behooves us to kind of examine the metaphors, and they can lead to an even deeper understanding.
Can I introduce a different angle, or do people want to say a bit more just about the nature of evil and its place in the cosmos?
Well, let's see what Demos has to say, if he has anything.
Yeah. In regards to the object orientation thing, it's a good model, and I think that the difference occurs in the Platonists needed to have a model that goes beyond being, so that they could speak of the one imparting good upon all things while being beyond being. That is why they didn't focus so much, I think, on analogies that would rely on mind and intellection. And while it's a good model, I think that why the radiance model is so preferred is because it's the best model at explaining the relationship of the good of the one towards all being. And I think that that's where if there's a difference here of opinion, it comes into that. I think that it's because, Rogue doesn't, you don't accept the absolute ineffability of the one beyond beings, if that's my understanding, yes?
I think in order to resolve that, I definitely want to resolve the semantics and like how we define being, because a lot of people kind of define it as like, and if this is getting too tangential, feel feel free to cut me off.
No, don't worry. All of these discussions are extremely tangential.
Okay. But a lot of people define it as like kind of like a particular kind of like thingness, right? Like a particular rather than a kind of universal being. Like I kind of define being as like the same as reality, like what is. So, well, I do like, don't get me wrong, I see the logic in a lot of apophatic sentiments. To me, like if you define being as like reality, to say the one is like beyond reality, it kind of doesn't make perfect sense to me. I can kind of see like if you say it's like supra being in a way that's like it's the principal underlying being, but I mean you ever hear like Plotinus talks about it a little bit, how the principle in the effect must be present in the cause in some way, like principally. Then being would kind of be in the one in that way as well, and so would like Intel or Nous and Soul in that way. Although to kind of credit the idea, because I think Plotinus actually did explain it in a way that kind of makes more sense, to me personally at least, is he takes nous or intelligence, and it kind of seems to be because I think he equates it with some kind of like dyad, because you have when you have like thinking, you also have like the object of thought. So you kind of immediately have this kind of two-ness, or almost like that would be the first subject-object distinction, whereas the one kind of wouldn't have that. That would kind of, in my opinion, be a pretty, if my understanding of Plotinus is correct there, pretty good vindication of it.
Yeah, the understanding is in Plotinus and the other Platonists is that if, as Aristotle has it, the first principle is mind, then there is this inherent two-ness to it, which must be resolved by having it grounded in something that does not have any distinction between subject and object, and that is how Plotinus first explains the first break in the ontological series of mind looking upon the one and starting the process of things breaking away rather from the one.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very, very good point. When I read that in the end, yeah, it's probably like a couple weeks ago. I was pretty impressed with it. I think it definitely articulates it pretty well. Although I think, I think there's definitely conversations worth being had about it, because there's still like some like implicit quality, like implicit mental quality, even in the ground of the mind, and whereas like intelligence as like the second hypostasis would be kind of just the actuation, of the ground, its own ground. But I don't think really that any Platonist or Plotinus even really contends that. I do see why you would really want to maintain the extreme simplicity and unity of the first ontological principle. So, yeah, I do understand.
I think I like the way you put it, but I think that this is kind of implicit in Plotinus at least.
Yeah, I'm like halfway through the so I look forward to reading more.
I think we can all agree that nothing in the universe is sexier than the Aeneid.
I think. Oh yeah, Déaglán had something to say.
No, it's fine. I actually worry that we're going too far off track. So
Yeah,
I was gonna.
Let's get back on the proper rails. We're running toward Albuquerque somewhere. But yes, where were we originally? Yes. What even is evil? You're refuting dualism. That it's silly inherently. I mean, hell, there was even that late Zoroastrian movement, the Zervinists, if I remember correctly, who felt that the dualism of Ahriman and Ahura Mazda was silly. So they postulated a higher principle that was above both of them, which does relate to the creation of a thing necessarily creates its opposite, which somewhat reminds me of a bit of a Hegelianism in a way.
Yeah, I feel like dialectics is actually the perfect, like, at least a really good model to understand how things function in the material world. Like, it really does seem to be the case that everything creates its opposite in a way. And this is just because this is what I've been studying, but my focus has been on lately. But in terms of regards to like accelerationism and that whole milieu, you could say that the original impulse was, the acceleration of McMahon at CCRU back in the 90s. And that was born out of sort of disillusionment with mainstream leftist political project. And that naturally led to their sort of para-left or post-left way of basically destroying everything that was human and holding people back in these structures of like what they could see as the preformations of what we would call today like political correctness. But after like the 2000s, like early 2000s, it sort of died out only to reemerge. And around the time that Curtis Yarvin started writing, when Nick Land covered his blog and started writing in response to that. And afterwards, that led to the offshoot of many like different accelerationist branches. Key among which I would say was left accelerationism, which still sort of exists to this day, but it's pretty weak to my understanding. But like as a result of left accelerationism coming into being, right accelerationism was also spawned as a response to that. And I really do think that's how things kind of happen here. It's like something gets pushed, and then something else pushes back in the other direction. But that only implies that these dualities that we see in the world themselves are temporary. They are fundamentally, ephemeral. There has to be a grounding for them to both even do this drama upon. That is the eternal, unchanging divine.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree that the perception of duality is just that it is a mere perception, because if the opposite is created simultaneous to the thing itself, that implies that essentially that they must have always existed, that they're not really in true contention.
Right, and this is one of the basic metaphysical intuitions behind Platonism or Vedanta, right? That what's the expression? Ta penta re, everything flows, and things are always coming to be and never fully are. But there has to be true being grounding that flow, otherwise nothing would come to be in the first place, right? And that's kind of the first intuition that starts to get you down the track.
Any thoughts on that, Demos?
Yeah, relating to what you said about the Zoroastrians, it's you can see this happening in real time, as you said, because they had this dualistic system where there is good and there is evil, or light and darkness, I guess they would call it. But they realized that this makes no sense. At least some of them did. If these things exist, they must be grounded in a principle which is common to both. Otherwise, how do they exist? You can't have, at the base of all things, you can't have two things. Because if you have two things, don't they share some background in common which makes them two things? How are they two things if there isn't one thing as a background for them to appear against? So in real time, the Zoroastrians realized that dualism makes absolutely no sense. So I think Zurvan is the principle of time, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, they did come to a sort of monism just by applying common sense. The Manichaeans did not. Manichaeans, I guess. They did not. So maybe the Manichaeans were extra stupid.
We clearly need a Persian correspondent, because we bring up the Zoroastrians a lot. I don't think we actually know that much about them individually. Theologue, you had something to say?
Yeah, the one thing bringing about its opposite is a really good point. I think Spinoza had something that was omnis determinatio est negatio. It's not exactly the same, all determination is negation, but what that kind of reminded me of when I first read that was how I actually kind of made a spin off of it in the way I model metaphysics, which is omnis definitio est negatio. So all definition is negation, because when you define one thing, it necessarily defines what that thing is not. So the way I kind of look at reality as it's like becoming more defined is that it's one thing's definition creates the definition of other things. I think that's actually where plurality generally arises, in my opinion. But yeah, I think that was a really good thing to bring up.
Within the Platonic system, I think that this should, I would relate this to the principle of the limit and the unlimited, in the sense that although we cannot speak of an arcade of evil, we can say, and that is, I think, where many get confused in regards to Plotinus, who perhaps carelessly, in some instances, defines matter as the principle of evil. The appearance of evil relies on the principle of the unlimited. And the principle of the unlimited is what allows matter. So that in that sense, we can trace the appearance of evil to that, whereas we cannot trace it anywhere else. In that sense, it can be, the confusion can arise in that we can speak of a principle of evil, but that would be wrong because evil is accidental. So in order to speak of something arising by accident, we can relate to the principle which allows for its appearance, but we cannot blame the principle for its appearance, if that makes sense. Perhaps someone might say that this is not a satisfying solution to the problem of evil, but I have not seen a better one offered by any system.
I actually had a quote lined up related to what you were just saying, Demos, from Fritjof Schumann, and I know some people in our group are not super fond of the perennialists, but that's actually what got me into Platonism. And in Schumann's scheme, which is almost identical to Platonism, he speaks of the absolute, which is the one, and then his principles, which are essentially the same as limit and unlimited, are called perfection and infinitude. And so here he is talking about what Demos just said, where he says, infinitude, which is an aspect of the divine nature, implies unlimited possibility and consequently relativity, manifestation, the world. To speak of the world is to speak of separation from the principle being the one. To speak of separation is to speak of the possibility and necessity of evil. Seen from this angle, what we term evil is thus indirectly a result of infinitude, hence of the divine nature. In this respect, God cannot wish to suppress it. Likewise, in this respect, and only in this respect, evil ceases to be truly evil, being no more than an indirect and distant manifestation of an aspect of the divine nature, precisely that of infinitude. So,
yeah, that's a great quote. That's what I was talking about. I applaud Schumann.
Is it okay if I throw the curveball I was asking about in, or do people have more to say on this part of it?
I mean, I've said my piece, more or less.
So, I said at the beginning that the problem of evil is a stumbling block for people to come to views similar to ours, and I think part of this is not just strictly philosophical, but it's psychological and emotional. So I think someone can listen to these arguments and say, okay, I can kind of see where you're coming from with this, but the problem is that humans, well, maybe not the problem, but humans are not purely intellectual creatures, right? We have will, we have passions, and I think it's one thing to explain away something like what Demos was talking about before with seeing in nature how one creature feeds on another and you're suffering from that, but you can see how it contributes to the greater whole. And I think it's not so hard for someone to wrap their heads around that, but the problem is this kind of truly heinous and wicked evil that we see in something like, to use a recent historical example, something like the Jeffrey Epstein disclosure, where you see the most heinous sorts of acts of the will or turning away from good, and they're committed not by random outcasts and psychos who have no social standing, but instead we see them in the halls of power, we see them in the ruling class. And I think real challenge is for someone to say, do those philosophical arguments actually address this sort of real wickedness that we see? And I think they do, strictly speaking. I think it's very difficult to motivate the intellect to ascend to that kind of position when it does such damage to the emotions and psychology of people to see that sort of thing, and to still try to hold in their minds that this world is a divine emanation.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I was just going to say that, like the distinction that I mentioned earlier, when you have rational beings, they have a certain capacity to act. So in order for them, it is in their nature to be amphibians, to be in between spaces. Not spaces, but in between ontological spaces. So, rational beings, in order for them to actualize their essence, they need to be able to choose. Something which is not true of purely intellectual beings, which do not really need to choose. So, for example, the gods do not have and I know Christians don't like to hear this, but gods don't have the option of doing evil or of not being perfectly good, because they don't need to. They don't have that deficiency. We do. So, in the Platonic system, strictly speaking, choice is a deficiency, because if you're good enough, you don't really need to choose. You're just all good all the time. But us mortals have in our nature the capacity to choose, so that we take our sort of, if I could phrase it like that, God-given attributes of being rational, and we can turn this towards evil. So I think that this can explain where the Platonic system situates humans, can explain why we have such a capacity for evil. It is precisely because we have something divine in us, we are rational, and because we are sort of lower down, we can take that and use it to do truly heinous things, because according to the same principle, we are always chasing after our good, but because we are not whole and we're not complete, we can turn this towards evil. So we can turn this towards deficiency in a full way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and having that capacity, this is another bit from Chuan, I don't think it's original to him, but he says because of these capacities, man has the ability to bring himself lower than any other mortal creature. Just as our capacity for good is the greatest among creatures in nature, our capacity for evil is the greatest. So, my cat can't ascend to highest goods of which human beings are capable, but by the same token, he can never do something as nasty as what I described earlier.
I don't know. There's some pretty mean cats out there. I would say an additional fold I would is that as I think it was Aristotle said. I'll admit I'm not that well read on Aristotle, so I'm just kind of half remembering something I read years ago. But said that people are incapable of doing things they do not believe are good. For a person to do something that they do not believe is good, they'd have to be literally insane. And assuming that most people are rational actors, the reason that a lot of people do good is because they have been twisted, in a sense, to believe that evil is in truth good. Either due to a sort of cultural solipsism, where they believe only their own benefit really matters, or that this evil is a tool for them to accomplish some other later abstract or, distant good, perhaps. And being rational, we can, rationalize this sort of thing better than, say, a cat. Probably. I don't know. Maybe cats are evil. Who knows? Theologue, you were going to say something?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that I saw what Déaglán was referring to as kind of a evil without like any apparent reason. Well, like no like instinctual reason. Like you mentioned that animals, like carnivores, like they hunt prey, and some people see that as evil, but it's easy to understand why they do it. But some of the like human evils, like common human evils, seem to be probably most distinct in like psychopaths. It's almost without any apparent cause. And yeah, they probably, I'm sure they do have their own like rationale. Tying into what Demo said, it is definitely, humans have a unique position with it because we are elevated, like you said. We kind of have more agency. We have that rational part of our soul, and I think we have a very unique position with, we exist on a very, I would say, particular scale of reality. So we interact with a very, defined manifestation of reality, which, but we also have like this interesting kind of more, I would say, in a way, greater access to the divine. I wouldn't say it's like it's private for like animals, but in some way, in like a rational way, we can probably by a combination of our intuition and discursion, we have like this interesting, unique access. I think all those things tie in to allow for pretty interesting, events of evil, and I think ultimately those kind of play into what was said earlier about reality, or one thing defining its opposite. So if reality was kind of maximizing its definition in one manner of speaking, it kind of makes sense for that all this to play out. You kind of have maximum evil, and in reference to it, you truly understand virtue, whereas like virtue by itself with nothing, well, only on one level, obviously. I'm not saying that even apparently evil things are necessary for the good to exist, but in just, in this manner of speaking, it kind of does let you orient yourself on virtue a little bit better than it would without. If that makes sense.
Yeah, in relation to that, I think that the Indian systems have karma, which is an excellent scheme, but the Platonists also, not necessarily to that degree of elaboration, have this same principle to explain why mortals need to be in contact with evil in order to ascend. Because, as I said, the gods and higher beings don't need to apprehend things one by one. All apprehension is natural to them already, but we here have to apprehend things one by one. So in order to understand what is good, we have to face evil as well. But that is only an accident of our position. It's not to say that evil is a principle of its own. It's just that we cannot hold. We're not purely intellectual beings. We are amphibian beings. So if we go to things one by one and cannot hold all things in their totality, we necessarily have to face deficiency, which manifests as evil. And for example, I'm not very familiar with the particulars of the Epstein case, but in such cases, to bring a little bit back to materialism that I like to do, each person will instinctively know what is good for them. But because we are deficient, we do not necessarily know how to sort of direct that energy. So that people who commit evil acts will know what their good is, but they will misdirect it. So, for example, such people, or Epstein, or I'm more familiar with the case of the Nexium guy, for example, will sit down and think, okay, I'm alive, why not have sex with as many teenagers as I possibly can, and acquire power in however unethical means I can. Why not? What's stopping me? It's good for me. So there is a misidentification which results from mortals not being in a position to apprehend the good completely efficiently.
Well, it also further harms it by the fact that that the culture of the day is deeply unethical and immoral, where, well, other people are doing this, might as well get my own slice of pie, is a fairly common source of logic for that sort of behavior. Everyone's already doing it. What's one more person doing it going to really... It's not creating more evil. The amount of that is kind of limited, but at least I could benefit from this. And the fact that there's no checks on that sort of thing, because we have abandoned, essentially, any idea that there are checks on evil, I think is a big source of that.
Yeah, so I appreciate all the responses to my query. I think I agree with essentially everything people are saying, and the way to address it is to just the so-called emotional or psychological problems of evil rather than strictly philosophical, is to insist that even in as Demos was saying, even in those cases, people are still pursuing some kind of partial good, however lacking or distorted their perception is. And Rogue Theologue had talked for a moment about psychopaths. Now, this is apocryphal, it's not something I've studied in depth, but I have heard from mental health clinicians who work with psychopaths in the prison system, that sort of thing, that a common phenomenon is, like Aloysius was saying, that psychopaths will perceive people who say to them, why don't you live an upright life? Why don't you turn toward justice, some sort of higher manifestation of good, rather than committing these base acts? Their perception is that you're kind of naive, you're a sort of a goody two-shoes, maybe you don't even really mean it, you just don't have the will or the cleverness to get away with the kinds of things that they're doing. And so you see there, even then, this perception that they are pursuing good, it's just that the state of their soul is so distorted that they are aiming very badly, aiming very far from one or the good, and about as low as you can get while still gaining any kind of good at all.
Yeah, the best explanation I've heard from this, from the Hindu perspective, is that the nature of the self, which it shares with Brahman, with the Absolute, is that of Sat Chit Ananda. So Sat is like truthness, beingness, like being, existence. Chit is consciousness, and Ananda is bliss. So there's like a sense that existence, that life, is fundamentally existent. It fundamentally is. It truly is. It is conscious. Like consciousness is a necessary aspect of being. It doesn't emerge. It's not an emergent property. It's not something that we created. It just naturally exists as a component of being, of the self. And Ananda is divine bliss. And so, because of that, even every ensouled, every embodied Atman here in the material world is naturally chasing after happiness, trying to attain happiness, because of that innate nature driving them towards it. The only problem is that we don't recognize that all these things are transitory. And so we seek after happiness among transitory things, among the things of the world, rather than seeking after it among the eternal and unchanging divine, which is where we tend to go wrong. Otherwise, like in that sense, right, there can't be such a thing as evil per se. Like people don't do things out of a sense of evil. They might do things malevolently or maliciously, but it's because they gain some kind of pleasure out of it, because they think that's good for them. Like it's not. No one would do evil if it made them feel bad. There must be something that they gain out of it.
Yeah, 100% agree. And that Satchit Ananda scheme is very similar to the intelligible triad in Platonism.
Yeah, I agree with that. The way I would say that there is a relationship between evil acts and misidentification is that people can become confused by the unreality of images. So, for example, if you, going back to the allegory of the cave, if you become fixated on the shadows, you will come to think that you can attain what is good only from the shadows. You are looking upon a real thing, but it's only a dim reflection. So the most common misidentification of that is that you look to material things and assume that this is all the good there is to, take out of the world. But yes, there is good in material things, but it's only reflected. There is no inherent good in them. They have good because they partake in good, like all things. So if you make the mistake of identifying all the good that you can attain in the world with material things, it follows that you will act in evil ways, and that scheme also solves the problem, the psychological problem, as has been mentioned, that many people ask, why do good people get bad things, bad things happen to good people, and bad people get rewarded? Well, bad people may get rewarded in material terms, but they don't actually get rewarded with anything because they lack virtue. So they are cut. If you lack virtue, you are, in a very real sense, cut off from good. So it all stems from a misidentification. If you only think that good comes from the reflections, you cannot be in contact with good itself. You can only be in contact with a reflection. And that is how I connect. In most cases, I connect evil to materialism.
Okay, that actually brings up a very interesting point because, like, as you mentioned, right, you are interacting with the reflection of the good or shadow of the good. You reflect your the good, and I think your identification of it
Arca?
is realism.
Mind
Yeah.
repeating that? You cut out for a bit.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I was saying that I thought the identification of materialism with the shadow of the good is quite interesting because it reminds me of a verse from the Bhagavad Gita that's been bouncing around in my head since we started. Basically saying that, like, the act of worship in and of itself is divine, is godly, and will inevitably lead one towards God, regardless of who one is worshiping. Whether one is worshiping God himself directly, whether one is worshiping one of the devas, whether one is worshiping the forefathers, or whether one is worshiping the ghosts, which in Sanskrit are called bhuta. The word bhuta has several layers of meaning. It can mean ghost, of course, as in this case, but it also means past, and it means material element. And I think the identification of materialism as evil, but matter as not being evil in and of itself is quite fascinating because, like, ghosts are necessarily evil beings. They only exist because some great evil deed was performed, or the person who died was unable to let go of their attachments to life. Their existence is a subversion, it's perversion of the process of life and death. But even if one, through ignorance, is worshiping ghostly entities out of some misguided desire to attain material, power and success, the act of worship in and of itself is a naturally humbling thing, regardless of what, people like left-hand path occultists or Satanists might think. You can dress it up all you like, but you are propitiating a higher entity, and through that you are learning humility, even if the entity you're propitiating is, quote unquote evil.
Yeah. I mean, that does relate to, like, a lot of historical practices where, like, in fact, that would well segue into the worship of gods that many people would ascribe to be evil, but aren't. And people think, that means that this is a god of evil. But even, like, demons, like, for a key example, most famous because of its appearance in the Exorcist series, is the demon Pazuzu, and was worshipped in Mesopotamia, despite being, this isn't like, a sort of deal with Ishtar, which I'll bring up in a bit, where it's like not actually evil, it's just sort of unsavory but necessary and good. But no, Pazuzu was ascribed to be evil, like absolutely, totally not very redeeming. However, it was powerful nonetheless, and it was seen as perfectly fine to invoke something that was evil to accomplish a good, which in this case it was to ward off other demons, specifically those that would harm pregnant women. And I think that ties well to what Arca was talking about, how worshipping even a ghost is better than worshipping nothing at all. But to transition over to like the other element where it's a lot of people who don't get it and still think evil is a thing, like how Dionysus does a lot of things that people consider unsavory, but is nonetheless good. Maybe talk about that, how good, about how the perception of evil does not actually indicate actual evil.
Yeah, I think also the first thing I thought of, you brought that up, Aloysius, was maybe this is a sign of being too online, but I thought of Jordan Peterson recently posting about Kali, this alleged Kali worship, and yeah, you brought up Dionysus being a good example, Odin being a good example, Shiva, these deities who have qualities that we might think of as dark or destructive or
I prefer the word unsavory because
unsavory.
Because that's just a matter of preference, really.
Right, sure. Or even sort of anti-social or associated with throwing off the norms and limits that are typical in one society. And that is part of the plenitude of being. These are aspects of being, the unsavory aspects, or the exceptional or transgressive aspects are still part of the cosmos. And since in Platonism and Hinduism, you have this cyclical understanding of the cosmos as going through different yugas, that the end times or the destructive times are also times of new creation, and so these destructive deities have their proper place in the cycle of things, because the terms escaping, Manavantara. This cycle will come to an end and give birth to a new one, and so that can only happen through these destructive forces.
Any further thoughts about that, Demos?
Yeah, I do not know whether there is any difference of opinion between the Hindu perspective and the Platonist perspective in regards to whether it is possible or truly evil entities, ontologically superior to man, to exist. In Platonism, I don't think that's the case. At least that's my understanding. Is that if we, in order to situate something as more evil than humanity, we would have to see it as being lower, further away from good, compared to humanity. So it would be also less powerful, less potent, because the two are connected. So that in the Platonic scheme, you can have beings that have fallen so far from the good that are vengeful ghosts or something. But they did so, they fell to that position in a purely human way, through wrong choices, through misidentification. But you cannot have truly evil deities. That concept does not make sense within the system, because God is good. That's not just in Platonism, in the Hellenic systems, all the Hellenic philosophies, even down to Epicureanism, which many people today would call atheism, they also accepted this. No philosophical system, no Greek philosophical system rejected the absolute goodness of the gods. So the notion of evil deities does not exist in any of the Hellenic philosophical systems.
Arca, you were going to say something?
Yeah, RK should correct anything that I got wrong there about Hinduism.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I think the very attempt to, label gods as good or evil from, from not only from human standards, even more egregiously, conditioned, unenlightened human standards, is just incredibly short-sighted. And for example, here, I can give you the example of Lord Ram and Lord Krishna. So Ram and Krishna are both, they're the same God. They are, depending on who you ask, either an avatar of Bhagavan Vishnu or, according to some Krishna-centric sects, Krishna is the origin of all the other avatars. It's relatively
Yeah. Seems Arca's having some technical difficulties. I'm seeing it light up, but I'm not hearing him.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah, you're good.
Better? Okay, sorry about that. Right, I was saying that essentially, regardless of specific theological differences, Bhagavan Ram and Bhagavan Krishna are basically the same God. And for Vaishnavas, they are, God, like with capital G, supreme personality, Godhead, all that. If you look at their actions in their life, Bhagavan Ram is held up to be like the paragon of manly virtue, of straightforward action and righteousness in all things. Whereas Lord Krishna is considered to be the trickster, the one who subverts what is nominally righteous in order to achieve something that's metaphysically and, ultimately much more important. However, even within that, supposed distinction, there are moments in Lord Rama's, pastimes where he engages in trickery in order to achieve a greater good. And that idea of being able to define, man cannot be the measure of all things, especially not of what is righteous or unrighteous. The dependence of righteous or unrighteousness is on the nature of God. He is the one who ultimately makes things righteous or unrighteous.
So, any further thoughts on that? Any particular deity one wants to bring up to talk about, the non-evilness?
In regards to whether man is the measure of that, I agree that there are, in the fullness of reality, there are certain things which to man appear to be bad, but are not. So we are stuck with words. But what I was saying is that virtue is, by necessity, imitation of the gods. So what is good in humanity depends on the gods, right? So if we act virtuously, we are imitating the gods. So by virtue of that, we can fairly confidently say that the gods are good. That does not mean that everything that we perceive in nature which depends upon the gods will look to us good, because our faculties for understanding good, as we discussed earlier, are not the best. So we are capable of misidentification, and in reality we see certain forces which can be destructive to us. Those who depend upon goodness, like all things. But since we cannot see the full picture, we shouldn't make the mistake of falling into a dualism, as we discussed earlier, and assume that these things do not ultimately serve the good, because ultimately all things serve the good. We shouldn't be led astray by seeing things like people acting badly or earthquakes or whatnot to indicate the reality of some evil principle.
So, any further thoughts or elements of the discussion anyone wants to bring up?
Sure. I think everything you guys are saying kind of relates to what I said earlier about object orientation might be kind of interesting to add on. That the object in that model would be the kind of the self-objectification of the subject. So it's not as if the object would be evil, which seems to be relating to what you guys are saying. Because it's not because of course the condition in the subject and the gods would be the most universal ones, is evil, and it's not because that condition is what's objectifying, but rather it's object orientation would be kind of like a reification of the object as the real in itself when it's not, rather than the object actually being the evil principle. Remind me of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And introducing that language of object as reification of the real is, I think it's a helpful way to me to get my head around what you meant by object orientation, which I didn't fully understand at the beginning.
Well, if that's all we have left to say, then I would say it's a good place to call it. Final call for any points.
Well, if I would add one thing, it would be what would you guys think of, how would you situate, now we're getting into mythological and that would be a thorny place to tread, but what do you think of certain traditions having gods, like Loki, for example, who, in that particular tradition, if it is not corrupted by our Christian sources, because basically all our sources on that tradition are written by Christians, that particular tradition, the Germanic tradition, seems to say that all evils in the world in some way come from Loki's loins, because he gives birth to all the troubles that ail the world. And that's the example that comes to mind right now. But what would you have to say about certain mythological traditions that seem to attribute evils coming into the world from gods?
Well, we also have to take, if we're talking about the mythological context of Lopt, then we have to also consider the fact that he was the blood brother of Odin. And,
No, I was going to say that yes, I'm bringing it up because Loki is a member of the family, and he sits at the table with the family, and he, I don't remember what the poem is, Locusina, yeah, probably Locusina, where he insults all the gods, and he provides a very, important, service in calling out their bullshit, so to speak, in bringing a certain sense of order to the heavens. So he does good in many ways, but certain sources also seem to credit him with actual evil. And I think that if I were to speak on this myself, I would say that mythological sources need to be, we need to be careful with mythological sources, because mythological sources not always mean the same thing. They're a bit like plays, where you cast certain characters and they fulfill certain roles. So you can, in a mythological story, cast one of the gods as a villain to bring out a certain point, but we shouldn't necessarily extrapolate a consistent theology from every mythological story. So, for example, sticking with the Loki example, I don't think that it's wise, if we take that tradition to be pure and not contaminated by Christian meddling, we should not extrapolate from the stories that present Loki as the source of all evils some sort of dualism or whatnot in that particular tradition. I think that if we are careful about our mythological exegesis, we can understand things as they are in the Hellenic tradition, where, at least with Platonism, all evil was not attributed ultimately to the god.
With Loki, like Aloysius said, him being the blood brother of Odin, and also just being included as one of the gods in the Aesir, that, in conjunction with him being the kind of cause of evil, well, people like us understanding evil for what it actually is, which is not a principal reality, it actually, kind of makes sense that what evil actually is, or the things that kind of permutate into what is considered evil, being included in the Aesir, that kind of makes sense, because ultimately it's not like a distinct principle thing, but it kind of, and also going off of him, what you said about Loki kind of being an ordering principle, if he had something to do with evil, which has something to do with material kind of as like the objectification of like immaterial reality, it's almost like its own self-definition is the way I put it, which doesn't order it per se, but it does kind of define it, and of course souls then interact with that self-definition. So it's almost like Loki would kind of have a dual aspect, not like principal duality, but him, if he, had that relationship with evil, and yet he engenders Hel, Fenrir, and also Jormungand, if I'm not mistaken. Obviously that's kind of damning in a way, but yet he's contained within the tribe of the gods. It almost reconciles, like implicitly reconciles the apparent duality, because he's not like, cast off into like a different genus. I mean, of course, Germanic mythology has the Vanir as well, but I don't think that would quite constitute that. But yeah, that'd be my thoughts for Loki, and I'm sure there'd be something similar for other mythologies. You could what you said about them not being like taken straightforwardly should I mean even Plato said that about, well, if I'm not mistaken, Plato said that about Homer, and that's probably true. Because if you take it at face value, it would definitely mislead you, but the way I understand myth is it's kind of like getting at, because okay, well, if you have like a universal principle, it will reflect to every particular, right? Because it's universal. So myth, I feel like, kind of just is almost like cataloging some kind of play of these universals upon each other, not necessarily speaking to like a strict theology, which of course I'm in favor of, but kind of relaying some dynamic, would be my opinion on that.
I would say, I would say if there is a true, like, evil, quote unquote, unambiguously, it would be Nidhogger, which is a manifestation of chaos, akin to Tiamat, or Typhon.
Yeah, if I can address the Loki question, because I think you're right about Nidhogger. Because interestingly, right, he's said to survive past Ragnarok to continue gnawing on the new tree. With regards to Loki, I think it would be mischaracterization to call him the father of all evils. Perhaps more accurate would be to call him the father of the instruments of evil. He, in and of himself, like what they're doing is not necessarily evil in and of itself, right? Like their actions and the outcomes of their actions are not. They don't exist unto themselves. They exist because they were fated to happen. The death of Thor, the death of Odin, the death of Tyr, all of these things were fated to happen in one way or another. It's just that these are the instruments of their karma. These are the instruments of their consequence. It would be, it'd be just as wrong to suggest that a sword or a gun or any weapon is evil just because it's made to kill other living beings. Its existence of it does not, it doesn't have an existence unto itself. It is the wielder. In this case, in the Norse case, at least I think the understanding of the wielder is weird. Would be fate, which is, it's an almost non-incomprehensible impersonal force unto itself, which has everything else woven up within its web, or tied into its scheme. And insofar as I think the point about it being a play is very apt, because in Hinduism, especially Vaishnava Hinduism, there's a concept of the Lila, which is the divine play. And this is basically the understanding that every avatar of God, when he appears on the earth, is essentially putting on a play in which all the other gods take part to enjoy the company and closeness of the glory of the Lord. And he does this in order to give his devotees something concrete to think upon, to meditate upon, and by which they can come to love him even more. So, mythology is very much a play. It is an act put on by the gods to some extent in order to give their devotees something concrete to grasp onto, to tide them over, the ocean of chaos, to tide them over the uncertainty and incomprehensibility of the material world.
Yeah, we touched upon this earlier to say that humans have need sometimes to go through evil in order to understand the good, and that is where I would place certain myths that appear to say that gods bring great evil upon man. Ultimately, it is to the betterment of men. For example, Antheus and Dionysus. Antheus denies Dionysus, and that is why he ends up being decapitated by his own mother, and his mother holding his head. that is obviously not a good situation to end up in, but the myth is not saying that Dionysus is an evil god. It's saying that humans are fallible, and sometimes in order to reach towards the good, they have to reflect upon evil, which is just as less good, a reflection. So there are certain myths which have that function of explaining how humans have to face the consequences of their actions, and those consequences may be terrible to them personally, but that ultimately leads them towards the good. And in order to deny this, one has to assume that materialism is true, and the dead don't learn anything. That if you die, there is nothing to learn. But with all the religious systems we're talking about, there is the concept of reincarnation. So what you can suffer in order to learn, because your soul will take that, your consciousness will take that learning and integrate it even after your body dies. If you accept materialism to be true, there is nothing really to learn, and it's ultimately an absurdist system, because you have nothing to learn, there is no meaning, you impose meaning artificially, so ultimately, if you try to ground it philosophically, it all collapses. But if you assume that mortals can learn, even through suffering and even through death, then you can start to understand how in all these myths mortals are punished and all their evils seem to come from the gods. It's that the gods are chastising them, so to speak. I don't know how I would explain the Loki myths using that framework, but I am confident in putting forth that framework for certain myths about Dionysus, wherein he is presented as a terrible god who you should not fuck with.
Yes, I think the idea of calling a god evil because it chastises wickedness amongst men is fundamentally the perspective of a criminal. It's the viewpoint of a criminal. Like, is a king evil for murderers, thieves, and rapists?
Can you repeat that? We lost you.
Oh, geez, okay, sorry. I was saying that the idea of calling a god evil because he castigates, the wickedness of man is the perspective of a criminal. Would you call a king evil for laying down murder, rapist? Obviously not.
Yeah, you're
consider that evil.
you're roboted a little right there.
Oh gosh. Okay, is this better?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I think I'm slightly running out of battery, so that might be it. I'll probably hang up soon. But right, essentially, the act of punishment is a net good, both for society and for the individual being punished. It shaves off the weight of the negative karmas that person has accrued through his lifetimes of iniquity, through his lifetimes of impiety, and gives them the chance to attain a better birth down the road. The punishment from the gods is essentially sanding away the wickedness that we have coated ourselves in. It's not wicked unto itself.
Yes, exactly. And in this particular myth that I mentioned with Pentheus is, in the myth, an atheist. He's a denier of Dionysus. So mean, it is the wickedness of it. We see the act as evil because the act is seen through the eyes of a wicked person, or as you said, a criminal. If we see this objectively, we see that this was good for him because now he's not an atheist, he's not a denier of Lord Dionysus. In order to deny this framework, you have to accept materialism and assume that you cannot learn beyond your own death.
All right. So, any further statements, or should we close it out here?
Yeah, I just close briefly by saying faith is not normally a word I use. It's problematic. It has a lot of modern connotations of just believing, sort of irrationalism, believing just in an emotive and fideistic way. But I would say that, just to speak to my earlier, I raised about the emotional and psychological problem of evil rather than the philosophical one, that if there's something to be said for faith, it's to assent with the will to the legitimacy of these sorts of philosophical arguments when one is going through periods of evil. That such periods ultimately make sense, ultimately are resolved for the reasons that we gave earlier.
Well, I think that's I don't think we really have anything further to say on this topic. This is so far the longest discussion we've had. So, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time we come up with something in like 7 years. Well,